Hello, everybody. I'm Juggling Lessons. This is my guest, Quayd. Today, we're going to talk about critical race theory. I get to learn. I've over the past heard probably many presentations that were kind of poor and didn't really fill me in on the question of what critical race theory is, and I've heard some that are better and more complete. Today, I'm hoping to get educated. Quayd, tell me about yourself.
Well, I'm an English instructor, so I teach at some local universities. I'm specifically interested in argumentation. I have my own program, What's Your Argument, where I just want to know what people's arguments are, and then from there I ask questions, and the hope
I
is
am
that we can
subscribed. You should be too.
yeah, yeah, and the hope is just kind of that we can change the way that conversations happen around even controversial topics. That we can kind of find a lot more common ground and find a way to navigate this really mucky universe regarding what's true and even on some level what's moral. That's the hope
Mm-hmm.
anyway. So
Cool. I'm all in favor of learning to argue better, not in the winninger sense, but in the continuinger sense.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing for
Cool.
me. It's like I get into conversations with people and I do deviate from street epistemology just a little bit in that I
Hmm.
am fine with approaching the idea of trying to persuade them, but I also
Okay.
go into the conversation very much willing to be persuaded and have been
Hmm.
lots of times. So to me, I just try to make it a fair game. That's what I try to do. I tried my best
Okay.
to make the rules consistent so that if they do things a certain way, I'm convinced. And hopefully if I do certain things a certain way, they will become convinced. That's the ideal
Cool.
situation, but
How often do you run into a defensive posture?
all the time.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's very, it could be the area that I'm in. It could be the way that I do things.
Hmm.
Probably a mixture of both actually, but I do run into defensive people a lot and it
Hmm.
becomes aggressive very quickly. And then you kind of got to step away at that point and regroup and
Yeah.
so on and so forth.
Cool. Yeah.
Cameras help though.
Yeah.
Cameras, it's a weird thing with
Defensiveness.
cameras.
Yeah. Defensiveness versus like effectiveness is a trade-off. With street epistemology, we so much lean into the avoid defensiveness, even at the expense of a, achieving an understanding of truth, or getting to truth, or even coming to a clear conclusion. We back our goals way down to, can we see evidence of critical thinking?
Yeah.
So like that, and which is fine.
Hmm.
And everything is necessary. We need the Aaron Raws in this world. We don't need Aaron Raw to learn how to do SE.
Yeah, I want to be an in-betweener. I don't want to be as bad as Matt Dillahunty, or yeah, what some would call bad, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
be as like polite or soft-handed necessarily as Anthony or some of the other SEers. I'm
Mm-hmm.
hoping to find a good in between, not to commit the middleman fallacy, but or the middle
Yeah.
lane fallacy. But
Oh, that the best idea must be the one in the middle of things. Oh, I agree.
right.
That would be a fallacy, but it's often true. It's still real. Um,
Yeah.
the middle road is at least a good default position to try out first. Tell me about critical race theory. But first of all, what's your position on critical race theory? Are you on a scale about it?
Yeah. I'd say I'm about 70 to 80% assured that it is a working theory. It's one that tends to work for uh, what I'm not sure is a certain percentage of lawyers or people in the academic field.
Hmm.
So that's my position: is that it does have some validity to it, and it
Mm-hmm.
is useful to some degree. To what
Okay.
degree, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But in
All
terms
right.
of my
So
own assurity, I would say
70%
70.
that it
Yeah.
has application is useful.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Now let's describe what critical race theory is, and pretend I don't know.
Yeah.
Explain it to me like I'm 5.
Yeah. So I go based off of I really fixate on the idea of theory, which not everybody does, but just the idea that it's an explanation for a set of facts that we see in the world. So it's
So theory in the scientific sense, not in the colloquial hypothetical sense.
right.
Good,
And some
good.
people have interpreted it that way, and they could very well be correct. It's just not the impression I've gotten from listening to
Okay.
certain people talk about it.
And I'm
Certain
looking for
people
your
think.
version of it, and it doesn't necessarily have to match anybody else's.
Right, right. Yeah, so it is just the idea that racism is a large part of it is systemic, and that
Hmm.
it tries to explain certain facts that we see that other models that we have around racism don't seem to fit as well. So, in terms of theories, we
Okay.
also know that they change over time, so it could very well change. But
So it sounds to me like it's a model that actually has predictive function.
I don't know to what level of predictive function, but yes, there are facts that have been created, uh, that have been compiled over time that we could have guessed that's the way it would have been, given critical race theory being true.
Okay.
So, if we do a study, so for instance, critical race theory has been around for a while, and eventually we do I forget exactly what it's called, but the exoneration project, where they go back and they review court cases,
Okay.
and they basically try to see if the evidence was originally sufficient enough to convict that person. And
Mm,
so
mm.
critical race theory may tell
So
us
a
that
review that says if we remove the racial bias, does the case still work, or did it rely upon a racial bias to achieve a conviction? Something like that.
actually it's just generally they go and they review people who are on death row,
Okay,
and
specifically death row.
yeah,
So
and
the
it doesn't have.
extremes.
Yes, and yes,
Hmm.
specifically death row, and it also shouldn't have. They're not necessarily looking for race, as far as I understand. They're not looking for racial components. They literally are just going through the court case again, looking at all the data and asking, was this data
Okay.
actually originally sufficient to convict this person? And they've overturned a lot of convictions. And
Okay.
critical race theory may predict that even though there's nothing in the law that says you have to convict minorities at a higher rate for
Hmm.
certain crimes. It still is the case that the vast majority of people who have been exonerated are minorities. The vast
Okay. So
majority.
disproportionately, the exonerations are coming out on the side of the minorities, even though at least theoretically the reanalysis is blind to the question of race.
Theoretically, right? Yeah, theoretically, and then also the idea that the law doesn't say that that has to happen. So there's something else that's going on with the system that isn't
Sure.
in explicitly racist, let's say.
Okay. I had a question, and maybe I'm jumping in at the wrong time, but let me throw it out. Was there a time in the past when racism was the morally upstanding ethical choice?
Was there a time when racism was the morally upstanding ethical choice? Is that
Hmm.
what it was? Um,
Yeah.
I would say there was a time when people thought it was. I would say that no, I'm the type of person that does believe that we can reach objective moral truths. And so I
Okay.
would say in a situation where you are considering the well-being of conscious things,
Hmm.
at no point was that beneficial to the common conscious being, like commonly speaking.
Hmm. Okay.
So it was beneficial
We're
to certain conscious groups.
sure. I'm going to go back way to prehistory, to hunter-gatherer times,
Mm,
when the 150 people that I recognized were almost all my kin, and anybody else that I saw was almost certainly going to try to kill me. Would
yeah.
would racism be, or you know, kin group selection, would that be the moral upstanding in that extreme case?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that, hmm, yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that we have to make day-to-day judgments. and those judgments. And I think that this is also another. This coincides with another lane that people take on this topic of critical race theory, in
Hmm.
that, what part of it is instinctual, what part of it is cultural. Critical race theory is saying that on some level it's instinctual, like it's innate to some
Hmm.
degree, and that kind of embeds itself in the system. So
Yeah.
I would say it. I think, yeah, I would say, yeah, I would have to say that it was beneficial at one point, and that, okay, let me say this actually. This is actually what I want to say. It's circumstantial. It really
Hmm.
is circumstantial.
Totally.
Yeah, if you're
Totally.
dealing with one tribe of people that you are certain, like, that they're a hostile tribe of people and they're going to
Yeah.
attack you, it seems like that's right within line with what we would call self-defense.
Hmm.
Um, if you're doing it as some othering mechanism and you're actually not so sure, which it's hard to be judgmental about the moral actions of people thousands of years ago, given the
Sure.
level of
Sure.
hostility and
Yeah. I mean,
whatever. But
I look at this because I think that the evolution of my forefathers is dominated by that time. And I think not being in that time is probably on the 10 to 20,000 year time frame, and the hunter gatherer probably was on the 200,000 year time frame. So
yeah,
I actually think that racism is in my genes to whatever degree it can be,
yeah.
and that as a modern man I have to unlearn it. But
That's
I'm direct messaging right now. Let's talk about your thing.
No, I mean, that's also my position as well. I am part Hispanic, and I
Hmm.
also my brother is part Black, so
Hmm.
we're a very integrated family. But still, I look white. Most people assume that I am white, and
Hmm.
so I've been privy to a lot of the, let's say, behind the door conversations that white people have when people of certain ethnicities aren't around.
Hmm.
Um, I do have some assumption that I've privileged from looking the way that I
Hmm.
have, as opposed to my brother.
Yep.
Um, and
Hmm.
then also I have my own biases. I grew up in the hood, and
Hmm.
or urban areas, or whatever you want to call it, and I know that I've made certain assumptions, not just because of the way someone was dressed, but because of their skin color specifically. That was a part
Hmm.
of the information that I integrated when I made a certain choice.
Hmm.
Um, and that also changed based off of where I was. If I was in an urban area where I grew up and I saw somebody that was wearing a certain dress but they were Black, I would
Hmm.
avoid those roads. If And then my
Hmm.
friend moved to a different urban area in which it's the same except it's white, and I had
Hmm.
to learn to, like, oh, now I'm going more based off of dress, because they will still try to attack you even though they're white. I had
Hmm.
made the I went to his neighborhood. It was a friend that had moved to a different neighborhood that was
Hmm.
what you might call a white urban area, and we were being attacked. And afterwards I asked him, like, what did you do to them? And to me,
Hmm.
again, that's that racial bias. I'd never once questioned, when we got jumped in a majorly Black neighborhood, what he did
Mm.
to them. It was only in that
But
situation.
when
So
the
it's
race wasn't part of it, you said, "Well, you might have had some part of this. You must have encouraged them in some way. You must have triggered them in some way."
right. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
And that was when I was really young. And then I come to learn, like, oh, there are all these other things going on.
Hmm.
And so, you look at that, you look at, the fact. And then also the other thing is, I have to be careful here, because it's also been a while since I've reviewed the facts. So I could be wrong about
Hmm.
some of them. That's something else that
Sure.
I always have to consider. But, the study where they have Black children pick dolls and
Hmm.
they overwhelmingly pick white dolls. To me, that is
Oh,
something that can't. Yes, yes, and that, to me, that is something that can't just be explained away. It's a Black
are
people,
these
right?
Black children in the U.S. where Black
In the
children
U.S.
are distinctly in the minority?
Okay, so I am.
I mean, if I were to do this in Nigeria, I wonder if that would be the case.
That's a good question. I do not
Yeah.
know the answer to
My
that.
my my nurse is from Nigeria. He's tall and amazing. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be an interesting experiment to do. But it's not one that conventional racism really gives us an answer to. Like, why do black
Okay.
people? And there's also the implicit bias test at Harvard, which has been called into question for, I think, good
Is that where they
reason.
show you faces and of different people, and then they something reaction time
Yeah,
about?
you have to associate, like, what you want to do is they'll give you a word like good or bad, and you have to
Oh,
associate the
okay,
word to a face or a skin color. They do it with everything. They do it with age. They do it
sure,
with
sure.
male, female, and they do find
Mm-hmm.
that not only white, male, straight
Mm-hmm.
people are the ones having trouble associating good with black and bad with white,
Mm.
but even black people do. If you that gives you the
Okay.
results after people of every ethnicity have this preference towards white, male, young,
Wow.
and I think to some level straight. Maybe it doesn't do straight versus homosexual. I don't even know how you would do that, but certainly white, male, and young seem to be our preferences among
Okay.
like everybody. Which again, it's just
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Young is
conventional
obvious
racism
to
doesn't
me.
answer that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Young is a reproductive bias option. Um, Male. Hmm. I'm bi, so I expect I do have biases, but it wouldn't be normal in that regard. White. I grew up in a fundamentalist missionary school that was highly racist, and I had to learn my unracism as an adult, not as a child. Uh, so, so I probably have more bias left over than I want, and I
yeah,
totally have white privilege, no doubt about it. Oh, and I have beard privilege.
yeah,
Uh, Beard confers me privilege, and age. I have grandpa privilege, huge grandpa privilege. That's probably bigger than white privilege for me. I can get
yeah.
away with shit. I can get away with shit because I'm a slightly old man who looks like a grandpa, and uh, I'll get cut slack where nobody else will.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think
Hmm.
that that's the way like intersectionality as a whole works, which is weird to me when people talk about critical race theory and they don't ever bring up intersectionality as if race is the
Yes,
only
where it
dynamic.
stacks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
it's the fact that it's highly that the idea of power and power structures is highly complicated. It's not simple. It's not just based on race. It's not just based on gender. It's based on age. It's based on, there is clearly a preference towards certain um, features that we would call handsome or pretty versus
Sure.
ugly, right?
Yeah.
And that creates certain power dynamics. It's a proven fact that people
Absolutely.
are more likely to get in positions of power when they're taller, right? Like
Yes.
so,
Uh, I think the taller presidential candidate wins 80 to 90% of the time.
right. And I don't think anybody's thinking like, oh, I'm going to vote for him. He's tall. Like I don't think a vast
Right.
majority of people are actually thinking
We
that.
we
I think
select
it's
we select
subconscious,
our alpha leaders based on size a
right?
lot. Yeah.
So it does seem to me that these things are subconscious, that they're on some level baked into the system because of us as individual actors. And that's
Hmm.
all I took critical race theory to mean.
Okay.
Um, and that's
I've also heard critical race theory make the claim that all white people are racist and we can't not be. Is that
yeah.
something you've heard? And was that something that you would think is included in it?
Yes, I've heard that. Um, I think that
Hello, Garrett Jacobs.
I think in terms of like pure, um, like how would you prove that? I think is one issue. Um,
How would you? Well, I how would you prove that all white people are racist? Yeah, you'd have to be able to make some sort of testable prediction, and then put a bunch of people to the test, blinding yourself to their race, and see if you can pick the white people out.
right.
I would think that's one way to.
Yeah.
I think I could test it.
So I think inductively we can come to a conclusion that racism
Thank you,
is
Boris.
more innate than we anticipate or realize.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's a much larger claim. And I think that there's a lot of information that supports that. Again, that you can make an inference or an inductive conclusion based off of that. But in terms of every single white person being racist, I have personal difficulties with that because I don't know how I would go about that. Seems like too large of a claim for me to.
Yeah, yeah. That one has strained my credulity. Also, I have heard a redefinition of the term of racist in something like you can only be racist in a downslope, but you can't be racist in an upslope. And that doesn't make sense to me. I don't
Yeah.
understand why that distinction could be valid.
Yeah, and
So
yeah,
that's one of the pushbacks I have about critical race theory is redefining racism as one directional.
yeah, me as well. And I think this is typical of, to me, the other thing that I always think about with this is like this is typical to scientific theories in general. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be some pushback. There's going to be nuances to it that you may not agree with. Scientifically, scientific ones seem to be better founded since the advent of modern science. But
Mm-hmm.
people still do it, and they do it effectively. And they've certainly done it to older ones. But in terms of the idea of, you know, the idea that you have to have power in order to be racist, I think is what they're saying.
Yeah.
And I think that doesn't really account for the multiple legitimate definitions that you can have of racism.
Sure.
And then also the idea that power structures are complex and dynamic. So, if
Yeah.
I'm a white kid and I go to a majority black school, which I have done, and
Mm-hmm.
all the vast majority of teachers are black, the principal is black.
Polytechnic High Long Beach. Woohoo.
Is there no scenario in which they can use that power against me because I'm white and that meets all the criteria?
Power
right?
dynamics are local. You might live in
Right.
a minority family and have plenty of power to discriminate against some group interacting with your family. And so you have localized power, even though in the overall, you are mostly powerless. So
Yeah.
power is not a single variable.
Right. And I
So
brought that
question
up
from the audience. Go ahead. You first.
I was going to say that I had brought that up to some people in the liberal community.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things was I brought up the fact that they had said that a black person can't have power over a white person. And so I brought up the fact that like my stepfather was black. I went to, schools where black was the dominant race, and they did single out students who were other ethnicities.
Sure.
And their response was, well, they didn't do that because you were white. And it's like, well, I wasn't responding to whether or not they were doing it because I was white. I was responding to you saying that black people can't have power over white people.
Yeah, it's silly. I spent my career doing computer programming, and a lot of it was contract work. And whenever I had somebody I reported to who was black, they were exactly in as much power over me as the other people who were other than black. It didn't matter. It was the same thing. I'm remembering a dear fellow named Carl, who I very much liked working for. Anyway, not important there. But the point is that they can't have power. Of course, they can have power over me.
Yeah,
especially if they're part of a paycheck. Of course, why not?
And that also goes to another issue with this whole thing for me too. Is again, I tend to think that critical race theory is substantiated by some evidence and that it's useful to some degree. But the other thing is, I often see people quote certain critical race theorists and say, "Oh, see, this is what critical race theory thinks," and that's like quoting Darwin and saying, "This is what evolution is." And it's just like,
right.
There's a difference between
overgeneralization there.
Right. Yeah. There's a huge difference between the general idea and what the individuals happen to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another reason that I'm just not like, oh, forget critical race theory. I tend to be like, yes, and it's like anything else. It's open to scrutiny.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to have some support, and nobody really has there's no one expert that gets to say what critical race theory is or isn't. It's a collective project. or it's a collective idea.
Question from the audience: how does CRT define race?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm still getting into the nuances of race being a social construct, and I haven't done that enough. You can split it along. I read I read one interpretation that I understood. I cannot remember it now. But I think for now we can agree that it's complicated and there are both genetic and regional components to it.
Okay.
That's what I would say. I would say that it is complicated, but mostly we can say, like, for instance, I remember looking at some pictures of, well, actually people in India and in Mexico, and they would very much be confused with a black person by a lot of people. And to me, that says that it's not just about genetics. It's about, the particular aspects of probably where they are too. They're probably in sunnier places, so they get darker tans.
Yeah.
So it is complicated. I don't think that means there's no answer. And I'm still contending with the idea that it's strictly a social phenomenon.
Yeah. I'm really familiar with the contrast between where racial lines are drawn in Brazil compared to the U.S. They would have a complete. They would draw lines in a way we wouldn't recognize, and vice versa, about who was in what race or whatever, and they seem to be using different criteria. And that really reinforces to me the social construct nature. But then again, the number true is a social construct. Almost everything, almost every piece of language is a social construct. So when somebody says, but that's a social construct, I hear two things. One, it's a tautology because almost every word that we can define, every term, every idea is a social construct, yes. And the second thing I hear is because it's a social construct, it's malleable to our will. We can change it. It's a social construct. We could redefine it. And that part I'm very open to. The tautology part almost seems like you're saying it, but
yeah. That is interesting to me. I think that I agree with you that everything ultimately is a social construct and it has to go through our subjective experience. We can't really understand it without the collective understanding that we all build together.
I have a favorite example of not everything is a social construct. Sex and gender. Gender is a social construct. Sex is not. And I can show you that because if I look at any mammal, they share sex. So it can't be our social construct. And the things that are things we can choose and define, I put into the category of gender. And like that. So it's an example of mine, and I'm totally willing to have that mangled and thrown to the, I want that reviewed. I want that pushed back on. But it's an example to where I can say some things are at a level below social construct before we get to them.
Yeah, I would say that
maybe I could argue that for the number two.
Yeah. And I would, like, at least from my perspective right now, everything is a social construct and everything goes through the subjective, though there are things that are clearly, like, to me, it's not either it's subjective or it's objective. Like, it can be an amalgamation of both. So to me, I would say something like gender is much more a social construct than sex is. So for me, in terms of sex, we still decide that this thing is called a male based off of whether or not, in some instances, and let's actually be fair about this and say in the vast majority of instances, there's a Y chromosome, and there's what we would call male genitalia.
Yeah, there's a strong correlation. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Even though there are
about a 3 sigma
exceptions.
correlation, as it turns out.
A 3 sigma.
About 99.6 or 7.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I got
the third standard deviation. It's the way I think about probabilities, and ignore me. I'm geeky about that stuff.
No, I got to get hip to that stuff, so That's something I'll
Yeah, we'll
learn
talk about
eventually.
deviations later. I
Oh
love
yeah, absolutely.
deviations.
Yeah, yeah. But to me, it's like, so I'm fine with the idea on some level of sex being a social construct, or at least acknowledging the aspects that are social constructs. We make up the word
Hmm.
male and female. We
Hmm.
define male as these things, but that doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as a Y chromosome. That doesn't mean that
Right,
there's not such a thing as, you know, genitalia, as male and
right,
female,
right.
or,
I see four sexes.
testicles. Four sexes.
I see four sexes.
I'm
There's the
interested
two
in
that are the
that.
most common, the one with the large gamete and the one with the small gamete that can, and in this case, I would say the one that can contribute to fathering a child potentially at some time in their life, the one that can contribute to mothering a child, birthing a child sometime in their life. Then there is the both. This is a rare case where somebody could actually produce both gametes and might even be able to self impregnate. And then there's the neither, where they couldn't do either one. And I think from a biological sex standpoint, that's about as far as I could ever define it.
Yeah.
And then gender is this lovely cloud of fuzzying between all those things,
Yep.
and is a lovely social construct. Um, Gina, our producer for today, says that mentioning social construct might be a way of dismissing, lowering meaning or importance, and saying, "Well, that's just your opinion," and I agree that it's often used in that case, and therefore can be pejorative and argumentative.
Yeah, I agree with that too. Yeah, I found that a lot, and I'm not sure why, why people want to take opposing. Well, I do on some level understand why people want to take such strong opposing sides on it, but it
Hmm.
seems like to me that there's a lot of overlap where we could be, again, building those bridges. We can acknowledge that something is a social construct, and that doesn't mean it's not important, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't correspond to some objective truth. It doesn't
Okay.
mean either of those things. But it seems like it's either you hate the subjective or you hate social construct, or
Hmm.
it's the only thing that there is to consider.
Yeah.
This is
I
the
do
closest
have a
thing I'm
hard
saying.
out at the top of the hour, so I have to bail in 28 minutes, no matter how interesting this is.
Yeah,
And so if you're up for it, and we still want to, a part two is highly welcome. So my next question is, what predictions does CRT make? It's a theory, therefore it makes predictions.
yeah,
What predictions does it make? And then my follow-up question, I know this is a compound question, so I'm already breaking the rules. My follow-up question will be something like, what other theories might account? So the first one is what? Yeah, I'm asking a compound question. I shouldn't even. I shouldn't even ignore the second half. What
yeah,
what predictions does critical race theory make?
yeah. So originally my example was, and again, I don't, I certainly can't say that it makes as accurate of predictions as some of the scientific ones. Or
Okay.
maybe it does. Maybe I can think of some examples. But so, for instance, off the top of my head, the Exoneration Project. Given
Mm-hmm.
critical race theory being true, you could expect, even though it's not written in the law, there's nothing that
Mm-hmm.
says that you have to um, convict or give minorities the death sentence at higher rates.
Okay.
Given the Exoneration Project, that is still what we found. Um,
That I like that theory. I mean, I like that prediction. That seems really, really solid.
or again, the fact that it seems black people seem to have a preference for whiteness as well. That's another prediction. Like, so for instance, the Harvard implicit bias test. The
Mm-hmm.
fact that on
What?
that
Why?
scale,
What is the theory behind that black people might prefer white?
because it's because racism is systemic and white people or black people are a part of this
Okay.
system,
Is,
they're
is
going to
that
pick up
in
some
a
of those
system where
preferences.
black people are the minority,
Yes.
like the U.S.? Okay.
Yes.
So
Yes.
would critical race theory say that in Nigeria, black people would prefer black dolls?
My guess would be that it that the circumstances are local. So
Okay.
I don't know much about Nigerian demographics. So if it's a majority
I'm just picking
black, I
Central
would
Africa or
expect.
something because almost entire, highly majority black.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it might make this is something that it hasn't predicted with certainty, but for instance, what were the Hutus and the Tutsis, right?
Sure.
Is that right? I'm getting that wrong.
That sounds right. And
Okay, I'm getting that wrong, but it might predict something like you can expect some of the same things that are playing out there or playing out here to play out
hmm
there because of
sure.
the minority majority
And based
demographics
on a
there.
very different selection criteria. Uh,
Right.
yeah, I'm betting most Americans probably couldn't tell a Hutu from a Zulu from sight.
No.
I don't know. I don't know what the distinction would be.
But they also
And
tend to
they're
be
probably
able
very aware
to.
of it.
And
Sure.
that's another interesting kind of like phenomenon too that to me is indicative of implicit race theory is that people tend to think that people who aren't Asian, a lot of them
hmm
tend to think that Asians look alike, even though
Sure.
Asians don't think that, right?
Right.
So
Right.
there's something very implicit
I'm
that
sure
they
when I was young, I couldn't tell Asians apart, and now I can tell South Korean from Japanese. I mean,
yeah
it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I've learned what those things are. Yeah,
yeah
and they
yeah
don't have to speak first
yeah
for me to know.
yeah
Yeah,
Uh,
same thing. I think most of my bloodline comes from Scotland, and
mm,
I'm betting that people outside of this couldn't tell me from Irish, but boy, can the Scots and Irish tell.
yeah
Okay,
yeah that happens a lot too.
I don't know that I
Yeah.
can, but because I'm not embedded in that. I'm in Los Angeles. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, things like the doll test, the fact that in
hmm
America black children seem to preference white dolls is something
hmm
that isn't answerable, and this is where we can transition into your other question. Doesn't isn't as easily understood under the old model of racism, which is just an individual actor who is actively openly racist that we need to
hmm
combat and defeat, and then racism is gone.
Right.
That's not as it's not as easy to understand. Why are black children picking by a vast majority white dolls when there are black
hmm
dolls, even when there are black dolls available?
hmm
um, and to me that's better understood under critical race theory
Okay.
as opposed
Are
to the
there
old civil rights
alternative
model.
theories? Are there competing theories that
Yeah.
make similar quality of predictions?
Not that I know of. I know
Okay.
of the only other one that I really know of right now is the old or the uh, the model under civil rights, which is the idea that racism is explicit. It's something that can
hmm
be seen. It's it's certain white people that are openly racist, and that's all it is. And they'll say they're racist, and you know who they are. Like to
hmm
me, I don't know that that was ever formed into a theory, but I'm not as versed in this as maybe some other people. So
hmm
that's the only other model that I know that I've heard about that I've gone, oh yeah, I can see that that is different from the critical race theory model that says it's more
hmm
implicit. Um, and we see some things that don't really make sense under that older civil rights. Racism is explicit, and it's an individual phenomenon. There's just individuals who hate black people, and that's it. And
hmm
after they're gone, then racism is gone. There are
hmm
lots of things that don't make sense given that being the only case.
hmm
But I don't
hmm
know of any other ones.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Good. It's thank you for that. Um, one of my doctors, I think it's probably okay to say Dr. Ansari. I think it's okay to give her name because I honor her and trust her. She's really good. One of the doctors in the hospital wears the headscarf. And I said, can I ask you a personal question? Do you get pushback about wearing your headscarf? And she says, pushback is constant. Pushback is almost universal. You got to push. You got to just move along with it. And she and I were very much in the agreement that a headscarf in her role is not an impediment in any regard to her doing her job. Now, is that racism or is that like religious fear? I'm thinking that currently in America, Muslims are probably one of the more feared groups. And if there's 1.6 billion Muslims, 1.55 billion of them are wonderful people.
Yeah,
I'm speaking in round numbers about how many are the not wonderful people. They're just such a noisy minority and so scary in the world and so picked on in the public as to really infect. I'm not sure what the right verb is. Does CRT consider religious intolerance as similar to race? Obviously there's some intersectionality here.
Yeah, my guess would be no. My guess
Should
would be no. I think that again, as far as I understand it, the idea is that it really just focuses on the racial component. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't other components. So it may be interested.
Should we have critical religious theory?
Maybe we should. Yeah, that might be something.
Maybe we need another. Maybe we need another one, or an adjunct, or an asterisk added to the thing because reasons. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that there may be multiple types of theories that pertain to critical theory, where critical sex theory or critical. Again, like I said, something to think about and to couch kind of all this is like people have a preference towards, say, skinny versus obese. So there's a critical fitness theory or whatever, where people are going to innately bake in to the system.
Sure, and I totally get why. That's a sexual selection characteristic.
Yeah.
That in the extreme gives us runway models that are unhealthy.
Yep. Yeah. And so there may be multiple different forms of it, but critical race theory it may be interested, is there a racial component? And again, keeping in mind that this is mostly meant for the law, even though it's spread to other academic areas. But the idea is there a racial component when someone is looking at someone wearing a headscarf? Is it in some way associated with their race as well when they're making a certain subconscious preference? So it's not so much interested.
I can only see this much of her. I can't tell what her race is.
Really?
Oh, because she's wearing a mask for COVID reasons, and she's wearing a headscarf.
Okay.
So I get to see this much of her and her glasses, and that's all I've ever known. And I don't have enough information to determine a race.
Yeah.
I have enough information to determine a religion with 2 sigma confidence, maybe more. And in my relationship with her, that didn't get in the way at all. But I imagine with a lot of people, I can just imagine that a whole bunch of patients are going to like, nope, not her.
Yeah. Yeah, this also actually, I was just talking to my students about this too. There's another experiment where just to show how deep this goes, and it doesn't even have to be based on race. It's really based on just features. Generally, it's based on features. There's an experiment where there is one person who doesn't know what's going on in the experiment. I forget what that person's called, but they are being called on to shock another person.
Oh yeah, I'm familiar with that. And starts with an M. And I could have that wrong, but yeah, I'm familiar with it. It's one of those examples taught when you're talking about ethics in human studies.
Right.
Gone wrong.
And just that decision that they're less likely to do it when the doctor isn't wearing a white coat.
Yes. The white coat and the clipboard apparently are huge privilege.
Yeah. So the question I might have is,
Milgram.
How likely
yes,
are people? Stanley Milgram. No. Yeah. people are less likely. The question for me would be: are people less likely to take, even if they'll still take her as a physician? Are they less likely to take her serious because of her headscarf too? Would be
Right.
another
I'm
question that I
expecting
would have.
that to be an issue, and she did confirm that pushback was ubiquitous.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously an impediment of some nature, and apparently worth it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
my last two questions.
Yes.
These are the standard ones that I pull out of the bottom of the Kleenex box. What could you learn hypothetically? This is something you don't know today. You have to make this up. What could you learn tomorrow that would increase your confidence from, I think we started with 70, that critical race theory is useful, applicable?
Yeah. This might go down a different road, but what I would need, what would make me more confident actually would be polls of legal experts and
Mm-hmm.
academics that demonstrate their confidence in the theory would actually be one thing.
Okay. Okay. So if you found that the experts in the field had a higher consensus, that would move you.
Yes.
Okay. Is that the same for the other direction, or do you have a different hypothetical to get you to reduce?
No, it would be the same. Yes, if I found out that they were less
Okay.
confident or they were using a different theory or anything like that, then that would change
Okay.
my confidence level. Yep.
If we were to poll a different group,
Hmm.
is there another group that you would give weight to?
Maybe philosophers, but I'm not too sure about that.
Okay.
I
I'm
would,
going to throw a couple out there.
yeah,
Politicians,
no,
polling politicians. Was
no,
that a no? Okay.
no,
Polling school teachers,
no,
polling psychologists.
somewhat.
Cool. All right.
Yeah,
So thank you. Thank you. That really helps.
yeah.
Do you have any questions for me?
Um, yeah, I want to. I can say that. Um,
Yeah.
I guess.
And if it takes longer, we can totally have a part two. I'm totally open to whatever. And I
No, I
have,
think.
I think, 12 minutes.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I may say, um, how are you familiar with critical race theory yourself? And, also, what this is actually, yeah, I think I have a question. What
Hmm.
do you think about the way that the conversations are had around critical race theory in terms of the opposing sides? Like, generally, what are your impressions or thoughts about how people converse and argue about this topic?
I find I find the conversations to be in two very distinct camps without a whole lot of overlaps. One of those camps is the good one, like you and I are having, where we are talking about it in clear and open and doxastically open and willing to this and that. And the claims that are made are modest, and it's great, and it's legit and wonderful. And then there's the kind that I've seen where uh, where the proponent of critical race theory is blamey and angry and calling you a racist and argumentative and authoritative and pushing and making outrageous claims that are wild generalizations that are obviously untrue on their face. And I think mostly when people listen to those kinds of arguments and they are at all on the other side, those are the ones they remember and can demonize the other side as being completely daft, completely out of touch, and look at this person who's messy. I'm specifically thinking of a 3-part series that Anthony had with Vanessa. This is if you look on Anthony Magnabosco's channel under Vanessa, it's a 3-part, and she was doxastically closed and truth relativist so much that odd or even in the box couldn't be nailed down. That must be a social construct, and that was Western science, and so should be rejected. And it was such a radical, she was such the example to me of that bad presentation that is going to cause division and polarization and not convince anybody who wasn't already convinced to begin with. I'm not saying
Right.
she's wrong. I'm saying her argumentation style was bad, incapable of convincing anybody, and incapable of even being subject to critical analysis. And I don't see a gradient. I see
know.
this group and that group and nothing in between. Sort of like libertarians. You got right-wing libertarians, you got left-wing libertarians, but you don't have a centrist group in the middle that connects them. So
Yeah.
what does libertarian mean?
Right.
It means a little bit of anti-authoritarian, but that's about all it means to me at that point.
Yeah. And that's why I wanted to talk about it, because that's exactly what I see too. And it sucks because I think that happens a lot in academia and science, is that a lot of ideas, a lot of good, useful ideas get really bad names because the advocates of them are so hostile and so a lot of times aren't even good at explaining it or don't even understand it. That's another issue. And all those things, you got people that are completely turned off by what could be a completely good or useful idea or truthful idea just because of the presentation, of the thing. Yeah, I was watching Ben Shapiro talk on Bill Maher, and Ben Shapiro did a really good job at demonstrating that he had done a lot of reading on critical race theory, and the other guy just went to attacks. And it's just like, I'm not a fan of Ben Shapiro at all, and I think that a lot of his ideas are ridiculous, and it gets to me to see somebody else that really can't just meet him where he's at and address what he's saying directly. That had to make it about a lot of other stuff that I was just like, I wonder what a different conversation would look like that I could put out there that might work better. So,
of course, pot smoking conservatives, libertarian. Sure, maybe. I've known some pot smoking conservatives.
Yeah, I was interested in the idea of libertarians too. I don't know if I've met any of those. Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, on the political compass, I'm a little left and way notches down away from authoritarian. So I could call myself a libertarian, except that I don't want to confuse people. Yeah, I'm just going to say I'm anti-authoritarian and a little bit left, especially if you look at civil rights. I'm way on the left side of civil rights and that kind of thing. And then fiscal and like gun policy, I'm a bit on the right. And, I'm a mix. I'm a mix. Thank you, Quayd. I have wildly enjoyed this conversation. This has been fantastic. You know how to get a hold of me if you want to do this again on any topic. The answer is just yes and when. It's not if, it's when.
I might get at you about that left libertarian thing. So,
heck yeah.
All right.
Let's do it. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining. Thank you especially to Gina, who's been doing remote production. Now, I do have one negative feedback. I was asking that we make at least one or two obvious mistakes so that people will actually be convinced this is live and being rolled out in real time. And you failed to make any mistakes that I was able to detect. So next time, let's work on that. Anyway, that's my feedback. Thank you, Gina. And thank you for the rest of the production team. This is way not a one-man show, even though it looks like it sometimes. And thank you, Quayd. And we'll see you next time.
Yep. Have a good day.